Welcome to New Possibilities. I speak truth to power without fear. So, yesterday, Donald Trump signed an executive order banning Muslims from entering the United States. And he banned Muslims from several countries from entering the United States. And I want to point out those countries. So, it's not an absolute ban on Muslims, but it's the beginning of one. So, he has banned Muslims from Iraq, Iran, Syria, Sudan, and Somalia, and also Yemen and Libya. For most of those countries, the ban is for 90 days, and for Syria, it's indefinite. In addition to banning Muslims from those countries, Donald Trump has set up a priority. He has set up a religious test, as reported in the New York Times, and I'll post a link to that article in the description box to this video so that you can read it for yourself. So for people coming from Muslim countries, he has placed a priority on Christians. So it's like a preference for Christians coming from those countries. And he's also placed a priority on other religious minorities from Muslim countries coming to America. So he's placed these other religious groups over Muslims. And this, for all intents and purposes, amounts to a religious test. And that's unconstitutional. It violates the First Amendment. This country, under the First Amendment, is not supposed to establish a state religion. And by imposing these types of preferences, that's essentially what Donald Trump has done. He's set up a preference. Now, with respect to this whole thing of fighting terrorism, he claims that this is all about fighting terrorism. Yet he does not ban people from the countries that have actually committed terrorism in the United States. Countries such as Saudi Arabia, most of the terrorists who were responsible for 9/11 came from Saudi Arabia. But there is no ban on Saudi Arabian citizens. Also, some of the terrorists came from Egypt, United Arab Emirates, and other countries. But yet there is no ban on those countries. Now, some people will say, well, that proves that it's not about him discriminating against a religious group. He's just banning some countries. First of all, discrimination, often starts off being limited to one particular zone, and then it expands and expands, and the next thing you know, all Muslims are banned. The next thing you know, there are more restrictive conditions on Muslims. The next thing you know, there's a registry for Muslims in this country. The next thing you know, mosques are under surveillance in this country. The next thing you know, people are isolated and put in concentration camps. I mean, if we look at the history of Nazi Germany, you'll understand what we're talking about. It's a gradual process, and that's why it has to be stopped at the beginning of the process instead of after the fact. And the thing that's so odd about Donald Trump passing this executive order is that he passed it on a day that was supposed to commemorate or remember, well, actually to remember the Holocaust, to remember those who lost their lives during the Holocaust. But yet, here he is. While he speaks out against fascism that took place in Germany decades ago, he is engaging in fascism today. And that's hypocrisy. And that kind of hypocrisy has to be condemned. Now, some people will talk about the fight against terrorism. They'll say, well, there are terrorists in those countries, like in Syria, you have ISIS, who is, a terrorist organization that has wreaked all kinds of havoc and violence around the world. And I understand that anger. I understand why some people would be fearful. But also, people need to understand that terrorists do not represent all Muslims or even most Muslims. Most Muslims are law abiding citizens who are simply trying to live their lives. Many of those people who come to the United States are coming to this country because they believe in the ideals of this country, the ideals of democracy, the ideals of freedom of speech and freedom of religion. Ideas that they don't have in their homelands. So these people come here, most of them are educated, who have contributed greatly to society. They are not terrorists. And essentially what is happening is Donald Trump is engaging in a policy that collectively punishes a religion for the acts of a few purported adherents to that religion. That is no different from anti-Semitism, where a whole race or religion, of Jews is being condemned for their religious beliefs, punished for their religious beliefs, persecuted for their religious beliefs. And this is just the beginning. I mean, it's just wrong to judge an entire religion based on the activities or the wrongdoings of a few of its adherents. That's the classic example of prejudice. That's the classic example of bigotry. And that's what Donald Trump represents. He represents bigotry. He represents xenophobia. And it's important to point out that during that man's inauguration speech, he talked about how he wants to promote America first. That was a common slogan in his inauguration address. And yesterday I was on Facebook and I saw photographs, old photographs of the KKK. And the KKK used that same slogan, America first, on, in their rallies. They had signs bearing that title. They actually sold commemorative coins with that title on it, with that slogan on it. And given the fact that Donald Trump, speechwriter, the person who wrote his inauguration address, is Stephen Bannon, a racist, a man who is a part of that alt-right movement, which is nothing but a euphemism for white supremacist movement. That man wrote that inauguration speech. So it is no coincidence that he would have that slogan, America First. And I think that this whole issue with respect to Muslims is just an example of the kind of bigotry that Donald Trump is promoting. This country, if we continue in this direction without challenging this man, this country could easily move towards fascism. This man has already called for federal troops to go to Chicago. And I did a whole nother video about that, addressing that issue. But that's a dangerous precedent. But some people are so paralyzed by fear, so controlled by fear, that they are willing to give up their civil liberties. They are willing to allow the government to discriminate against people based on their religion out of fear. And that reminds me of that slogan where they talk about how people allow discrimination to go on. People allow tyranny and oppression to go on because they figure that it's not their group being discriminated against. It's like that slogan where it says they came for the Jews and I didn't say anything. They came for the communists and I didn't say anything. They came for this group and that group and I didn't say anything. And then finally they came for me and there was no one to speak out on my behalf because they had gotten everyone. So if they come for you in the morning, if they come for me in the morning, they could come for you at night. And that's one of the titles from one of Angela Davis's books. But it's a valid point. If you ignore the oppression of others, who's to say that your group won't be next? Who's to say that your group won't be the next group targeted by this administration? So I think that all affected groups, whether you're an immigrant, whether you're African American, whether you're a woman, you're a woman's rights advocate, or Muslim, or a part of the LGBT community, all these affected communities need to unite against this right-wing government. Unite against their agenda, unite against their appointments to the cabinet and to the Supreme Court. Because if we don't unite, this country could become a fascist state.